Hey everybody, it's Todd Geist with Proof+Geist, and today we're back with another episode of the Context Podcast. And the first big piece of news we want to get out there is that we have a new host. So Jeremy Brown did a great job with the podcast in its initial couple year run, but he has moved on to do his own thing in his own way, and so we need to get a new host. And luckily, we have Martha Zink. Cue up Martha there. And she is going to be taking over as the host as we dive into all kinds of new topics regarding FileMaker and Claris platform and everything else that we can think of that's interesting in this space. And we're going to start off with what we're kind of calling the modern FileMaker revolution, or as we'll get into it, sort of what's different about how you use FileMaker today as opposed to what you did years ago and what we think that means. So Martha, it's your show. Take it away.
I appreciate it. Well, I do want to say the same here and say thanks to Jeremy for creating this platform and starting it for us. Big shoes to fill, but I'm excited to be playing this part now. So modern FileMaker revolution, Ernest, Todd, you've both talked about this at Proof+Geist quite a bit. But tell me a little bit of what that actually means to you. Do you have like an elevator pitch of what that means?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying that we first have to think about how FileMaker is currently being used in the world. And I've certainly grown up in this space. Right? We've done all the cool things, all the not so cool things, all the big things, all the fantastic ideas, and sometimes down-to-earth ideas in this space. Everything from separation model to high performance systems in FileMaker, a lot of integration work, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think if I could sum it up, is that we've always imagined in the past that FileMaker is the center of the universe. Like it is the thing that becomes the growing monolith that eats up all the other systems because it can do everything. It can be your CRM, it can be your sales system, it can start to replace all the things that your spreadsheets were doing in different places, and we're trying to squeeze out all these business efficiencies because FileMaker is so easy to use, it's so easy to deploy, and start building up and building up and building up. And then we add more complexity, we add more sophistication, and that's been the arc, right? We're using FileMaker sort of to build essentially powerful business systems or powerful applications to run everything from small offices to massive corporations. Right? I'm here to suggest that we're in a very different landscape today. Right? If you think about FileMaker of that era as having done a certain kind of heavy lifting for the world, we have to start to imagine like what's next. And what's next is actually pretty freaking compelling. And I think that story hasn't really been told a lot. Right? So I think as a teaser, this is not an elevator pitch. I suck at elevator pitches. That's why Todd's here. Which is good. But I'd say that, let's begin by understanding what we came from and what we're coming from. And I think I'll bounce this up to Todd, but I think that in order to understand the modern FileMaker revolution, you have to understand the context that we're in.
Yeah.
And the context that we're in is that we're not on-prem anymore.
Yeah.
Cloud is first.
Yeah, let me just speak about the context. I think this is pretty interesting. And we named this podcast The Context for that reason. I mean, obviously it's got a term in FileMaker having to do with the relationship graph, but it's also all problems have a context in which they arise. And we like to think that that often when we're approaching problems, that it's some kind of green field and we can do whatever it is that we want to do within that space. And that's just not true. Like there are constraints, whether they're time, budget, systemic, whatever there are constraints under which you must operate. And in terms of FileMaker, there's a couple of things there that are really important. Like it depends a lot on where you have used FileMaker in the past and what you're doing with it today. So that's one part, is sort of how is the organization that you're involved with using FileMaker. They may have a massive system and it may be running a big chunk of their business. And you can't just pretend that's not so. right? But you also need to integrate with the new stuff that's out there, and the recognition that um, we can't really be on-prem anymore for many cases. People are remote, especially after 2 years of the pandemic. People are remote, and FileMaker solutions that have been developed on the LAN over many, many years are going to struggle in a WAN environment. And that's just the nature of it. That's just the reality. You're going to have a hard time getting people who are far away from that system to be happy with the performance of a FileMaker system that was developed over, say, a decade on the LAN, on-prem. So we're in the cloud now. That's where things are. That's where FileMaker probably has to live. That's where all of your other applications that you're using live. So that really changes things. And your context. So your context includes the FileMaker apps you're using. It includes the other apps that aren't FileMaker that you're using that you might need to integrate with. And those are probably going to be cloud native. And by cloud native, I mean things that are going to be accessed through a web browser that probably have developer APIs that you can integrate with using insert from URL in FileMaker's case, or HTTP in whatever language you're using. You're probably also going to have a set of user expectations that are very different than the ones that FileMaker grew up in terms of what an app should look like and how it should behave and what kind of components there are that you can give people to use as part of their UI. So we saw some of that be addressed in FileMaker 19 with things like the calendar add-ons and the other add-ons that we were instrumental in getting to the platform. So all that is the context that we find ourselves in today, and it just isn't the context that we were in a decade ago or even 5 years ago. So, but in terms of what you can do, there's an awful lot you can do. FileMaker is actually pretty good as a web database, for example. It works quite well inside the serverless infrastructure that you're seeing people use these days because the data is available over HTTP, which is really great. So there's a lot of advantages that you can get when you start to think about this in terms of we're in the cloud, right? We have a server running in the cloud. So that's really what the modern FileMaker revolution is all about.
The other thing, so Ernest, just to go back to what you just said a minute ago, you said that FileMaker is not the center, that we used to think of FileMaker as the center of everything, right? And to be clear, FileMaker has been the center of my career. So you're making me a little nervous.
Imagine how I feel.
So what do you mean by that? So is this, Todd, is this what you're saying too, that FileMaker is just a component, that the world is bigger than we've made it to be for so long?
Well, let me maybe bring this from sort of the business value proposition side of the conversation, right? Okay. Like, why was FileMaker so successful before, in the past, or prior to modern FileMaker revolution? Well, for one, web was hard and expensive and really quite terrible, right? I mean, the standards were poor, the UI was just horrendous. And you have to kind of imagine FileMaker slotting in before all these Web 2, Web 3 stuff, and after the old databases, like literally DBase and terminal systems, right? So if you think about this whole era of rapid application development environments, who was out there? Nobody credible, like 40 maybe, but no traction. FileMaker was really that tool that could really do that heavy lifting, right? Could really provide a modern experience that rivaled anything that you could build on the web or in older systems and so forth. And the thing that it was really important is that it could serve as like that stack, right? That stack that drove businesses, that gave people this engine to deliver value rapidly. That was a superpower. You can get somebody who knows what they're doing, build something quickly, iterate the bejesus out of it, and then all of a sudden you got something that does something much better than some big gigantic system that's running in the closet somewhere. But the stack's really different today, right? I mean, things have changed pretty rapidly, and from a business standpoint, what is the business stack? Well, it's not a single database application. right? Maybe using Pipedrive or Salesforce. Maybe you have your customer data stashed somewhere else. Maybe you're doing invoicing and billing through QuickBooks. Maybe you are looking at some automation from your web forms you're doing. Every business, every company, every organization has some kind of business application stack that you're using. And guess what? Most of that is cloud native. It's cheaper. You couldn't build that yourself. You couldn't build that yourself for 100 or 1,000 of the amount of R&D that's been put into these applications. Try building QuickBooks. Good luck. Couldn't do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So when you think about that, when you think about the amount of efficiencies, the amount of power and value that's been compressed into all these applications that are out there, that's the context we're in. And it's enormously powerful. That's the other thing, right? Businesses are not inventing the wheel over and over again. They're just using what's out there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I remember wanting to rebuild a lot of wheels in the past, right? Because it was hard to find anything that was affordable or easy enough to get into or to connect to FileMaker. But that has changed quite a bit.
I mean, it isn't even just like web apps and like, SaaS business systems. It's things like Slack. Yeah. How many companies run most of their business through Slack? Right? You're not going to rebuild Slack in FileMaker, right?
No, so but we're only in Slack because they took AOL IM from me. So otherwise we'd be integrating with that.
Yeah, but that's the reality, right? Slack is current context. So Are we just going to pretend that's not there? No, actually, Slack has a whole development platform. There's a whole ton of stuff you can do with it. And guess what? It can work just fine with FileMaker as the thing in the sort of behind the scenes that's responding to Slack to Slack bots or sending messages into the Slack channels to notify people of certain events. Like, there's no reason to consider Slack a separate part of what you do when you're working in FileMaker. You should consider it like SMS, like email, like any of these other things that you can reach out and touch with FileMaker. That's part of your stack. Web apps, Slack apps, QuickBooks, Salesforce, Pipedrive, all of these things, all of these cloud native things are part of what you can do with modern FileMaker. And so some of that started back with FileMaker 16, which was really the first time we got a hold of the tools that let us do that. We got insert from URL, which is a full HTTP client, and we got JSON functions, and we got the REST API for FileMaker Server. Those were all cloud native tools that we got embedded into the platform that let us do things like Slack integration or QuickBooks integration. So that's when it started. We're now FileMaker 19. We're several versions beyond that, and there's more that we can do there as well. But some of it requires changing your perspective, and it's not just about like, okay, there's all these apps I can integrate with. That's great, but there's a couple other things too that are pretty important. One is you got to have a server. Like, if you want to be able to have a Slack bot that talks to FileMaker, a file isn't going to cut it, right? So this is kind of the main thing. The app is called FileMaker, right? It's about files, and it was about files for most of its history. So that was where the center of innovation was in the file. The center of innovation is now the server, in my opinion. That's where you have to start with a server. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because you want to do an integration with something like Slack, you got to have a server. There's no way without a server. You have to have a server, and it has to be robust enough to be up and running, so that when you send a Slack bot message to your FileMaker server, it can respond to it. Otherwise, you're not good. So you have to have a robust server. And then if you want to do things with sort of another big reason you need a server is if you want to do modern development practices, because people actually are using your software for critical things, you don't want to be doing live development. So you want to have a dev server so that you can do development on dev servers, and you can do migration from dev to prod. This becomes essential because the apps that you're writing have to work. You don't want to be doing live development because that is a danger. It might break things. and you want to be able to have a dev environment where you can do things and test things and try things. So the server is the center of the FileMaker universe now, and that's another key aspect of it.
Now, one of the reasons for that is that, again, going with this framing of what was before and what is now. Like, why is this a revolution? It's a revolution because things are changing or have changed. The center of innovation was the file. The center of work was the file. Like, you imagine how work was done. You open up a file and you did things to it. You either put data in or you hit buttons and things happen. Paper comes out of printer. The center of work today is increasingly, and I would argue almost vanishingly so, like the file is such a small factor in that process. Where's work happening? Work is happening when you're sleeping. Work is happening when you're looking at a browser and data's flying from the interwebs, into your file that you're not even thinking about. Work is happening that you don't see. And this is the key, right? And we tend to think of FileMaker as sort of the surface where you can actually see work happening.
Yeah.
And that's not what's happening.
In fact, in the early days, it was really just typing very fast for you. And that's what it was doing. Right? It was literally automating the copy and paste of things around the FileMaker system. That was the first version of ScriptMaker. The first coding that we did outside of calculation fields was literally macros, people-driven macros. That was the automation. Automation is now happening not just because somebody opens a file and clicks a button or enters data in a field, but because some signal comes in from some other service, Salesforce, Slack, whatever. I've got a new lead. How do I process that? There's no person doing that processing. This is now happening. It may still be FileMaker code that's running, but it increasingly is running again. Guess what? Where? On the server. Whether it's not. You're not opening a file to do this. The server is responding to, handling this stuff, and taking care of it while nobody's actually watching it.
Yeah. I think one thing that struck me was this idea of full stack. I mean, FileMaker was a full stack at some point, right?
Yeah.
You could do the back end, the front end. You could deploy. You could do all these things right within that little package. But I guess that was kind of the micro version of it, right? It's bigger than that, is what you're saying. And I think you're including more of you're professionalizing this whole thing, right? It's basically saying that it's not just about the development anymore. It's not about the file. It's not just about doing the work in the file. It's about deployment. It's about distribution.
There's a technical perspective to this, and then there is a business perspective to this, and they're both really important, right? So when we use the term stack, what do we mean? Well, technically, we always imagine FileMaker to be the everything, be all and all experience. I mean, we would go through amazing lengths to get a user experience just like the way we want it, by using all kinds of gimmicks and tricks, because that had to be in FileMaker, right? So there was no other surface where you could do that programming. It was just the FileMaker layout, the objects that you had, the tables, fields, whatever, right? But that's obviously different. And Todd, obviously, you can talk more about this. But today, the stack is enormous and very large, and some of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say. I mean, there's sort of I don't know if it's not a formal definition of what full stack is, quote unquote. But if you use the word full stack in a lot of tech circles, what most people will interpret that as being is a stack which can build user interfaces, custom business logic, and persist that data to a database, right? So that's a full stack. That's a full stack. Like if you're a full stack developer, that's what most people would think of. You're a web developer who can also write the back-end code to connect the data to the database. So in that sense, FileMaker is certainly full stack, right? So there's that. But in terms of like there are other parts of important critical data logic and user interface that you're not going to control. Like the business still needs to, like you think of take MailChimp, for example, or SendGrid, where you're designing these emails and you're sending emails out for marketing purposes. Like we used to do that in FileMaker. In fact, Proof had a whole product, FM Spark, around marketing emails from FileMaker. But it turns out that that's something that, because of all the spam wars that happen, it's just not something you can really do because of, and also regulations around the anti-spamming laws that are there, right? You really do need to give that functionality to a marketing email processor like SendGrid or MailChimp, or take your pick. There's quite a few of these. So that logic and that UI for building the emails is no longer going to be yours to control. Like it's just not. So now you have to think about, what do I want to, I still want to be able to send marketing emails, and I've got some data in FileMaker that I want to be able to, I've got a list of contacts. I need to be able to make sure that people that I choose in my FileMaker database get these emails. Well, now you're in integration land, right? So the point though is that you don't control all of the pieces anymore. You control data pipes. You can send data, you can ask for data, but you don't get to make a call on what that UI looks like for designing those marketing emails anymore. It's no longer your concern. That's incredibly freeing if you take that approach. I'm no longer responsible for that. I'm now responsible for just the integration, which has its challenges. I don't want to oversimplify it. Integration is a challenge into itself, but we have that capability now. And so, I don't even know what you'd say. Like, what's a business's full stack? Well, it's gonna depending on the size of the business, it's gonna include, several to dozens to hundreds of applications that are controlling critical bits of that app. And if you're a FileMaker developer, or you have a FileMaker app that's supposed to exist somewhere within that context, you have to accept that that's the case, because it is, right? Like, I think it's not. There's no other case. That is the world you're in.
I think that's a fundamental part of this that's important for me. That's from a business perspective. I mean, FileMaker is narrowly full stack in the sense that you can build front end, back end, web experiences, whatever, right? It's limited in its own way, but enormously powerful for what it does. But I think the more important point is that the things that make up a business stack are enormous. Persistence is not one place.
Yeah.
Persistence is in a lot of different places. Right? I mean, you think about, where is your network research data? It's not in your databases. It's in LinkedIn, right? It's somewhere else. Whereas, look at email. Your email is not in your databases, and that's a database, and so forth and so forth. And so, if we shift our mindset from just assuming that the stack is enormous and data is not in one place, and UI and user experience is not in one place, and business logic is not in one place, then all the downstream ramification of that is something that we need to come to terms with.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the key for me. Right. I mean, if you begin with those assumptions, then there is no other recourse. We have to reimagine how we situate FileMaker, because we think there's a really important role in FileMaker to play, an enormously important one, but it's not how we imagined it before, being the be all and everything, the monolith.
Yeah, and I think what's important about that is that it requires a different mindset, but also slightly different characteristics and skill sets. So, and this is why we get back to, like, when we talk about the modern FileMaker stack, or the modern FileMaker revolution, what we're talking about is centering a different set of ideas and technologies than what we used to, and that directly informs how we build value today on the FileMaker stack.
Correct.
So we have a server, and we've augmented that server with some tools. The biggest one being Auto, that we use to make the server even more powerful than it was before. And then we've gone one step further. We've got a whole hosting platform called Automatic that includes Auto, that has all those features baked into it, and a bunch of others which we'll be adding over time. But the idea is that if you approach FileMaker development from this modern context, you will quickly see that there are some key capabilities you need. You need something like Auto. That's our assertion, is that you're going to need some way to do automated data migrations, but also the other features that Auto has, which are things like receiving webhooks. You've got to be able to receive webhooks easily. And Auto has that built in. There are other ways to approach it. We've just decided to take what we know as the key features that you need to add to a server and add them through Auto. And then you're going to need to have some skills around web. People expect a certain polish around the way user interfaces look. They also expect you to be able to produce. They expect that if you have a database and there's data in it that you need to expose to, say, your vendors or your customers, that they're not going to have FileMaker. So you're not going to be able to say, hey, open up this FileMaker app if you want to collaborate with us. They're going to want a web app. So you need to build a web app, a portal of some sort that connects to your FileMaker data. So that's another skill set. You're going to need web skills. You're going to need them. And so we've chosen React as our front end of choice for these kind of things. React being a JavaScript framework, and Node.js and Next.js as our way of building these intermediary layers between that web application and our FileMaker databases. So yeah, you need these different things. It's not just about like, the data doesn't all belong to us. It's like you need a different set of techniques and skill sets to address it from this perspective.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the FileMaker development in the past has revolved strictly on a workflow, right? Like I'm adapting to what the users need to accomplish a workflow. And I liked your focus on expectations of people, whether that's from a web technology or a web design, whatever it might be. But I think that part is pretty key to me, seeing how FileMaker can tie so well to other components and meet that expectation, right? You don't want to open up your iPhone and then have one app that stands out because it doesn't make sense, right? They should all feel like an experience. So I guess that's a good analogy, right? The modern revolution FileMaker is this: you open up your iPhone and it's all these different buttons, right? It's all the different apps that you can open up and how they all talk to each other. But you need them all, right? It's not just a phone anymore. You need all.
I think that's a great analogy. I think the more we shift to this mindset that FileMaker is a component of a much larger ecosystem and even a marketplace, right? I mean, think of this as a network of apps, persistent layers, persistent engines, databases, experiences, workflows. And then you have to ask yourself, how do we leverage all of that with the platform that we love, which is FileMaker?
Yeah, and sometimes people get discouraged by some of the ways that we talk about this because there's new things to learn, et cetera. I can understand that perspective. I've certainly had to retrain myself a number of times since I started with FileMaker a long time ago. But the story is actually pretty good here. Like FileMaker's integration with these new technologies and these new ways of building, it's actually really strong. So we have a great REST API that means that you can build any web experience you want and project it to however many users you need to project it to on the internet, and your FileMaker database will be able to handle it. Now, you're going to have to know what you're doing there. You have to learn how to build applications in that way, but you can build applications that can address large numbers of users connecting to your FileMaker database the way that anybody else would address large numbers of users connecting to their database, whether it's FileMaker or MySQL or Postgres. Yeah. The same techniques apply, and we have that capability. It's all there. We have a REST API. We can cache things. The modern deployment frameworks coming from all sorts of different vendors like Vercel and Netlify and Fly.io and all these different players. They all have global CDNs that will cache data for you and cache HTML for you and files for you that you. And again, really importantly, FileMaker works with these things. It works quite well with these things. You just have to know to try and go and build them and figure it out. But it works. So there's not a reason to be there's not a reason to be bummed out. There's a reason to be excited that we have this thing that we've been building on for over 2 decades, and it still fits quite well within the modern way of building things. You're just going to have a couple different skills, and you're going to have a really good server or two or three. And so you have to start shifting in that way, but it's going to work. And it's incredibly, if you're a customer, if you're a Claris FileMaker customer and you have a lot of assets in FileMaker, you have important business systems that work, and you need to expose some of those, whether it's to Slack or to a web app. The great news is you can do this. You can do it. It's going to be possible for you to do it. And that's really what we're focused on, is how do you do that? Some of it is a mindset change. Some of it is things like auto. Some of it is things like simple queue, this message queue system we have. There's lots of new techniques and technologies that we can apply here. But the really good news is it's going to work.
Martha, I think that one of the key concepts here for me is that, well, first I'll say, I'll double down and say that the opportunities are enormous. So if this sounds like, oh, FileMaker developers, we're facing an uphill challenge, oh no, this is hard. I'm saying that you got to be kidding me. I mean, the amount of opportunity that's out there in this new space and this new world is just ridiculous. It's ridiculous because FileMaker is really good at doing one thing, which is to help people do work that is unique and specialized and the very, very long tail of problems that you cannot solve at scale. I mean, to bang out things that tie things together, to build custom experiences, fantastic, right? And we need to get out of this business of doing undifferentiated work in FileMaker. So if your idea of working in FileMaker is repeat a manual way of constructing a system over and over again, because that's the skill that you have, then yes, it can feel a little scary. But the moment we put ourselves in this mindset where we have an option to do work that's really differentiated, the things that cannot be repeated by a machine, a robot, a server, or an automation, then the world's your oyster, right? And there are countless examples of this, right? Go ahead.
I was going to say that the Claris pushed the idea of us being problem solvers as developers, right? And it's just like now we just have other fun problems to solve, right? Now we've got puzzle pieces that are built for us, and we don't have to build every little nuance of it. I mean, I think of something like Slack, or really anything. They're doing the upgrades for you and the updates and the new features, right? And I just get to take advantage of those, right? In my existing puzzle piece.
Huge.
Yeah, I like that focus quite a bit. I think it is scary to think of it as freeing, but I think that's right. And I get to focus on the stuff that I actually care about, right? Which is this really nuanced workflow that matters in those businesses.
But it's exactly right. It's what businesses care about. Yeah. Businesses don't care about how well you can replicate QuickBooks. They're just going to buy QuickBooks, right? What they care about is what you bring to the table that drives this unique business proposition of theirs. That's what they care about.
Yeah, that's true.
We all have to differentiate ourselves in every way, as a business, as a team, whatever. And we have that one tool that let us do this, and gobs of experience in doing this. So this is a happy story, not a sad story for me.
I think one of the, it's been a big move to move away from Waterfall development, and Agile gets thrown around a lot, but Agile is all about getting stuff done pretty efficiently, right? It's find what you can ship, iterate on it, get something out. Does this fit this model? Is this dependent on that model?
Yes. In short, like it's, we talk to a lot of developers, a lot of people who have businesses running on FileMaker, and the idea that you could take down their production system while they're doing live development doesn't make anybody happy. And we all, if you've done this long enough, you've done it. I remember stopping production on a custom glass tile manufacturer for the entire day. They couldn't make glass. They couldn't make glass tiles. The salespeople couldn't call any customers. Everything stopped because we did development on a live production system, and it didn't go well. And it took a long time to clean up the mess that we had made. And you just can't, that's not acceptable in today's world, that you could stop a business with 20 salespeople from actually making any sales calls for an entire day. That's just, you can't do that. So you have to have ways to do it. And that's where, one of the things that we work on quite a bit is removing the roadblocks to things so that what used to be hard gets really simple. So automated data migration is one of those things, so that you can develop safely in a development environment. And when the feature is ready, you can push it to production. And the downtime that might happen with that is very short, and you can recover and revert very easily if you need to. This is essential for any business of any size that's ongoing. You just can't take it down, right? So that's important. So when we got the data migration tool from Claris a number of years back, we immediately set out automating that entire process because it was still quite manual and required terminal and all these other things. And so Auto just removes that. It's no longer a concern. You can develop on a development server. You can test. You can put things behind feature flags. You can do testing. You can do all kinds of modern development practices on a test server and then push it to production with Auto at literally the push of a button. So we do a lot. There's a lot of different ways and a lot of different areas that we're working on that kind of thing. How do we remove these roadblocks to modern development? Just make it really, really easy.
Yeah, so it's possible to move away from live development, and it's this ecosystem allows for that, right? Because with these tools, you could deploy every day, probably,
yeah.
right?
We have a great story from Gearbox. They have a solution that if you're in the FileMaker community, you probably saw this at some point. It's a medical system that runs on ships, actually not on ships, in Papua New Guinea in the jungle, and it's connected to these big ships that sail up and down the coast of Papua New Guinea with doctors on them. The doctors go into the jungle and they service villages with medical needs, and I think it's actually focused a little bit on eye and also ophthalmology. And so he's in Atlanta. The main server's in, I want to say it's in like Berlin or somewhere in the EU. The ship is off the coast of Papua New Guinea somewhere, and the solution's running on an iPad in a jungle. And before, when he wanted to ship a new version, that was 8 hours of work to do that. Took his entire day to do it. That was all he could do. He couldn't do other things while this was going on for the entire day. A couple months ago, he emailed me and said, this is now just a couple minute long process. And in fact, it's changed the way that we approach development, because for the first time ever, I was able to ship 2 versions in a single day, right?
Pretty epic.
Changed how they approach development entirely on this process. And we get this comment all the time, because now instead of spending your whole weekend upgrading your vertical market solution, you get your weekends back.
Yeah.
Right? When you go from having to manually migrate systems all day, it takes you an entire day, to being able to do it at the press of a button, it takes a few minutes. That changes how you approach developing that system.
Talk about freeing, right? You're freeing your time, you're freeing your mind, your mental load. It's stuff that just works. And I think that's key there. Yeah.
What would you do if you could ship to production a few times a day? Because that's the power you have now. If you are working in this new way, with a server, with automated data migration, what would you do? How would you do your business differently if that was possible? Because it is.
I think we've identified a bunch of different capability aspects to this idea of a modern FileMaker revolution. But there's also this idea that to be modern anything, never mind FileMaker, to be modern anything, you are a learning organization. Learning is the center of being modern. It's the idea that we can adapt and iterate and shift and learn and make changes quickly. And I think one of the challenges with FileMaker in the old days is that, this has been challenging to do, right? But if you want to adapt to this way of thinking and then the way of working, deployment needs to be the center of your story. Migration needs to be the center of your story. And frankly, cloud needs to be the center of your story. Right. in all of those cases. But starting first with the idea that you can build, get feedback, test, ship iterate. I don't care what you call it. You call it Agile, call it whatever, Scrum, whatever, right?
Sure.
The idea that you can go through these loops quickly in the business cycle, in a decision loop that addresses business needs. If you can't do that, there's no story.
That's right.
What do you do? So I think what I'm hearing is that you're asking people to change their mindset, right? The way that they think about this, the way that they're going to think about development and what work they're actually doing, how they're going to add value. So how does that shift happen? Like, how do I developer Martha, how do I shift my thinking, and how do I know when to bring something else in, or what are my steps to make this work?
I would offer some shortcuts to get people thinking about this. If there's one thing that I would push people to orient their thinking around, like if I could pick one word, I would say it's speed.
Mm.
Like, and I mean that in every sense of that word. How fast your solution works, how fast you're deploying, how quickly you're learning, how quickly changes are being made. And if you're not optimized around these ideas, I don't mean rushing. I mean doing things at a pace that can respond to changes in an effective and credible way, within a healthy business cycle, right? Speed. And I also mean performance, like how much data you can collect, how well you can scale, like all these dimensions. If we orient our brains around speed, all these things kind of fall into place. You have to make certain choices to get there. If you don't, then we are going to fall into patterns of we'll negotiate with ourselves. Like, yeah, I can do this really complex, complicated thing because I can, and I'll sacrifice performance for it, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I was thinking about when you asked that question, what's the key insight that's driven me down this road? And I don't know that I ever named it before in this way, but I think this is it. So there's in FileMaker, we've always, you're looking at a layout. That layout is based on a table. Your user interface is tightly coupled to the data. The scripts, the way we do scripting, is also tightly coupled to the data and to the UI. And so that lends us to have a very coupled view of logic and user interface. And I would say one of the key things is try to pull those apart. And the reason is that the logic that you write, the things that you may want to do in FileMaker, and the data that you may want to access and change and update may not have anything to do with the FileMaker database. Once you start thinking that the script that I'm writing may have to be called from a web app or from a Slack bot, and you're no longer inside the FileMaker window, the FileMaker layout view to okay, the button's going to go here and the fields are going to go there, and I'm going to, slide out a slide panel to show this. And now I'm simply focused on logic. You can start to see where these opportunities lie. Once you have scripts that no longer care about where they run from, they can now be called from Slack, from a disconnected FileMaker Go app, from a web app, from a Lambda function, from Zapier, from a QuickBooks webhook, whatever it is. Once you get the idea that you can write scripts, you can write business logic, you can update data without having to think at all about the UI.
100%.
You can now start to imagine where this UI might exist. So I think a lot of people, we've all been very proud of the beautiful layouts that we built in the past and the cool FileMaker UI tricks that we did. And I'm not saying just forget all that stuff. No, but remember that you can do an awful lot without any of the FileMaker UI at all, whether it's called from a web app or as a FileMaker 19, you can make little web widgets, right, on the FileMaker layout in a web browser that talk to FileMaker and get the data back. They don't care about what layout. Doesn't matter. That web viewer does not care what layout it is on, right? So if you break those apart and you start to think that I can use my FileMaker data, the data that's in my FileMaker system, and I can use my scripting skill to integrate with anything.
Right.
then the world is your oyster.
So, in classic FileMaker vernacular, we say things like separation model, right? Separation is like the peak classic FileMaker design architecture
Yeah,
archetype.
totally.
With modern FileMaker, the word is decoupled. It's this decoupling. And, we can unpack that later. There are lots of different things that we can do. But this idea that we want things that are lightweight, that are loosely connected together, but are connected through the web, through the internet, through APIs, through services, both internal services as well as web services. And that is, and that is, that may seem complicated or difficult if you haven't done anything like that. But again, shout out to Otto, makes a lot of some of these things really simple and brainless with webhooks and whatnot. But that's where we're going with these things. We're taking pretty large, complicated systems, and we're making them much more lightweight, much more much more performant, much less dependent on internal structures and internal tables or itself or other files in the the FileMaker solution.
Yeah, I think I want to add to that and to my previous comment that the lowest level technique, the two lowest level techniques that I can think of that really start this process, you should be thinking in JSON.
Absolutely.
JSON is the key to all of this. That's the key to getting this whole process started. Pass data around your FileMaker systems in JSON, and use that to pass parameters. If you do that, you start to create scripts that we call JSON in, JSON out. So those scripts take everything that they need to do whatever it is they need to do in terms of business logic as a packet of JSON, and they respond with a JSON response. Once you have that, now those scripts can get called from anything: Slack bots, web pages, Zapier, webhooks, whatever. They can be called from anything and they will still work. So that's the key. That's the first layer of decoupling. And it happens right there at the passing data around your FileMaker system as JSON. So if you haven't adopted JSON as your standard for doing that, that's the key. Start with that. Yeah. And the other one I would say is insert from URL. HTTP requests are really central to all this. And we have a great script, which we will link to in the show notes, that can help you build HTTP calls much easier than trying to do it by hand with the native curl functions. But those two things are really, really essential to starting this process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know we're focused on the FileMaker developer mentality and changing that. But there's a little part of me that hopes that we can change the minds of people in the web world, right? Like, no, FileMaker should be part of your ecosystem, right? Like, come to our side. We have a secret that we want to share.
I don't think that's crazy.
No, it's not crazy. And it's certainly great. Like, the other thing is that there are a lot of businesses that are in FileMaker, huge investments, they're not leaving. So how do we get those folks to understand they have these other options, and they can bring in other. If you are a JavaScript developer, I don't care whether you're using React or Vue or Svelte or whatever you're using, if you're using those frameworks, you can connect to FileMaker. You can build user interfaces and other types of business logic that will connect to FileMaker just fine using standard web techniques. There's really no roadblock there. In fact, it's easier than other databases because FileMaker's REST API is HTTP. It's HTTP based. So if you have your data in like a MongoDB or in Postgres or MySQL, you have a native connection you have to mediate. Those can be done quite easily in some stacks, but if you're using like serverless functions, you can't do it. Serverless functions can live for just 15 seconds. There's no database pool. There's no native database connection that you can do at scale to a MySQL database that way. But FileMaker works fine for that because it's HTTP. So it fits well within the modern web space. And the reason why people don't know that is because we just haven't broken through in terms of communicating that, but it does. We have great examples of that, like in terms of working with companies like Netflix to work within their infrastructure and within the React. They have this React-based design UI kit, we were able to use that just fine with FileMaker.
That's awesome.
There were no problems. There were no like, oh, this won't work. It worked fine. So that's totally possible to do.
So my pitch for the web world and maybe the business world who are familiar with the web world, a web-centric approach to R&D and development and innovation is to imagine this problem, right? We live in a sea of this amazing business applications that are being built for scale. But the center of innovation for businesses have to come from inside.
That's
and
right.
so this is a cultural problem, right? So we've got a problem today where we've got all this innovation that's basically been outsourced to SaaS, web apps, modern platforms and frameworks. And all the business stuff goes where? That's still the problem. It goes to spreadsheets. It goes to, and what people will find constantly is that we try quote unquote low code platforms and tools,
That's right.
and people hit a wall, right? And the reason for that is that the very, very few good ones out there that are programmable. And FileMaker is this unique, weird, awesome thing where you can low code to, I hate to use the phrase, but pro code. But that's exactly why it's extremely powerful, right? And if you imagine that the center of innovation with businesses is going to come from below, and you want to support that and tap into that, FileMaker's got to be a friend.
Yep. And there's an article from the people at ThoughtWorks, which is a very highly regarded consulting company that does a lot of work with enterprise around software. And one of the articles they just wrote was you can't buy integration, which I thought was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What they're basically saying is that integration is now so central to what people do because it's how you connect all these disparate things together. And probably the best way to approach that, in their opinion, was to use a programming language, was to not try to do that with low code tools, because eventually you're going to hit a roadblock where you're going to wish you had a programming language. And then the other thing is if the center of innovation of how you build your business is actually a network of all these different applications together,
Correct.
That's your intellectual property. That's your business, is that stuff.
Right.
And do you really want that to be living on somebody else's stack? No, you want control of that. You want it. You want a programming language to do it in. You want it tested. You want all the things that you would normally do around a software program. You would want that around your entire innovation space, which could be just a lot of integration with a few key custom apps built on top of it and a web page that reaches your customers, right? So, yeah, there's still a tremendous need for a tool that businesses can use that can start low and go all the way to pro. That's really what it is. And I think people are really beginning to see this. You're hearing this word pro low code or low pro code, depending on who's saying it, come out now, which is people are they're hitting roadblocks with the low code tools, and there's no escape. FileMaker has escape hatches. It's got a REST API. It's got this ability to embed web apps right within the FileMaker layout. It's got HTTP. It's got JSON. It's got all these ways to reach out and to connect with all these other things that become very pro very quickly when you need it. You got to have that. And FileMaker is as good a tool as any for a business to use to build that space in.
The biggest risk in making any sort of investment, speaking from a business angle here, is that you get stuck and you have no way out.
That's right.
So that's my pitch. I'd say that, and that's true for business applications too. Like, I mean, and the way people get out of being stuck in a modern web app today is to build integrations with other things, to flow the data out, to do something else that you can't do. So you have two overlapping systems that do similar things, but one does it better, like Zendesk versus Pipedrive, for example. Right? This is a classic combination.
Yeah.
We flow the data around, and it works beautifully around that. Right? But what happens when your stuff is stuck, when your key business process is stuck in an automation tool that you have no control over? And it's not just that moving is expensive. Retooling is expensive. Enormously expensive.
Yeah. I like how this conversation started very much with my fear of FileMaker not being the center, but the word that came out afterwards is that FileMaker is still key to a lot of things, and I think I love that idea that even if it is not central, it is still very important, and I think that's inspiring to me, right? That I have more choices. I'm free from thinking FileMaker has to be everything when it doesn't, right? It could just be a really key part of the business, of the problems I'm trying to solve.
That's right.
It's one of the key tools that I can make anything out of, right? When I need to.
And I think the other, I mean, just to get stark real about it, if your idea of building value for a customer today looks like it did 10 years ago, you've got some blinders on. You're just not seeing where the value is. We have a world that we're in. We have a context, and it is new and different. And so adjusting to that, adapting to that, and creating value on top of that, and a tremendous value, is what we call the modern FileMaker revolution. At least that's the buzzword we're kind of kicking around now. We'll see if it sticks around, but that's the idea, is that this is new. It's a revolution. It's modern. It fits within the modern stack, and it still deeply includes FileMaker.
Correct.
Deeply includes FileMaker, because that's the world we're in, and it's accepting things like cloud first. Got to be on the cloud. You have to have a FileMaker server, so that you can reach other things, or the other things can reach you. You got it. So now from there, and then we go through all these steps we've been through, but we see it and feel deeply that this is an empowering story, not a scary story. This is the way forward. It's full of opportunity. You just have to embrace it. You have to accept the change that's here and go after it.
Yeah, I love it. That seems like a great way to end the podcast here. And I'm sure we'll have lots more conversations around this, right? I mean, there's plenty to dig into, whether it's the technical side, the business side. So hopefully you guys are stuck with me here for a while in future podcasts.
Yeah, we hope I want to get into some of the details. There's all kinds of things that we started talking about here that are quite deep. We talked about decoupling, we talked about events, and there's a whole thing we have to do around this thing we call simple queue, and there's a lot more to discuss. And so we'll be getting to that.
But all those things are what we call is modern FileMaker revolution.
That's right.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you both for your time. Much appreciated. And we'll be talking
Martha,
a lot
great
more.
job on your first podcast. I'm looking forward to many more.
Hopefully you'll have me around for the second. Yeah. All right.
Thank you guys.
Again.
All right, guys. Thanks.
Bye.